morning. I started rather, last time I spoke, with some thoughts regarding providence. And we kind of set the stage for that last time, just looking at providence in general. But today I want to look at the life of Joseph and think about how providence impacted his life and why that was. And so today we want to spend some time talking about Joseph, but we'll do that in kind of three phases, if you will. We'll talk about Joseph's life. I want to, at a high level, walk through his life. It's several chapters from chapter 37 to chapter 50 of Genesis, so clearly we're going to have to do that fairly quickly and high level. We'll do that first, just so we can remember Joseph's life and familiarize ourselves. And then we'll look at some of the examples of providence that we see in Joseph's life and what they meant to him and what they mean to you and I. And then lastly, we will have some takeaways, things that we can think about as we go home this week and apply in our lives and consider in the days ahead. God meant it for good. When I think about people in the Bible, and as I've gone through the exercise of studying different individuals where providence has impacted their life, one of the things that comes to mind is that the individuals we read about in Scripture are ordinary people. And what I mean by that is they have the same challenges, the same difficulties, the same failures that you and I have. We see all manner of challenges in their life, and if you had looked at one of these individuals on the surface and just met them outside of Scripture, you wouldn't see that their life necessarily was any different than anyone else. But what we see is the extraordinary actions that happen in their lives, things that they're doing, or things that come about in their life that are extraordinary. We look at them and say, how did this come to be? How did they accomplish these things? Well, the answer to that is providence. It's God's hand in their lives, God being at work in their lives and working through them to accomplish his purpose. And the whole thread of Scripture, from beginning to end, is tied together with God's providence. It's God working through these ordinary individuals to accomplish the things that he wanted to accomplish in this world, ultimately so that you and I can be drawn to him and be saved through his Son. Ordinary people, extraordinary actions tied together with providence. Well, Joseph is one of these individuals. You look at Joseph's life and you look at the beginnings of it, as we'll go through in a moment, and it's very ordinary. His life was pretty much like what anybody else's would have been at the time as a young man. And so as you go through the pages of Genesis and you look at how his life unfolds and you see the different events that take place, and you see ultimately him ending up being a very respected leader in Egypt, we have to look at what happens in between those things and start to understand how was God's hand in all of this, but also what choices did people make in their lives and how did God use those. And so we want to, at first here, just flip through the pages of Joseph's life as quickly as we can here and go through that, and then we'll look at those aspects of providence. We first start out in chapter 37 with the description, it says, of Jacob's family. It's just saying this is what happens basically to Jacob's family, and it launches right into the life of Joseph. And what we see is that Jacob is very fond of Joseph. It's a special son to him, and he, of course, we know the story of this coat that is made for him, and very colorful, and his brothers are watching this and observing this, and Joseph has these dreams, and these dreams basically are God telling them that one day all the brothers and even Jacob are going to bow down to him. And of course he lets them know this, and that doesn't go over real well, as you can imagine. The brothers don't take that very well. And so there's a lot of struggle in this family, a lot of strife going on because of these things. And they're very frustrated with Joseph. In chapter 37, verse 4, it says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. They hated Joseph because of the way their father treated him, because of how he acted. And these are choices that Jacob made and kind of to treat his son maybe a little more special. And Joseph maybe made some choices in the way he revealed these things that God had shown to him. But it created this strife in the family and this difficulty and this struggle. And so what comes about is this plot to kill Joseph. They look at their brother as he's sent out to meet them. Jacob says, go check on your brothers. Here he comes. Here comes the dreamer, they say. And he's there wandering along, and they're looking at him, and they all decide, we want to kill him. And on top of that, they're going to go back and lie to their father about what happens to him. So, this is spiraling out of control, their lives. They're making these decisions in their life to do these things. Well, what ends up happening is they toss him in a pit. Reuben kind of talks them into this, to putting him in this well. The idea being that he would come along later and get him back out and send him back home. Well, as it turns out, they're all sitting there eating and waiting, and it seems Reuben must have gone off to do something else, and then along come the traders that are traveling by. Midianite traders, and it says that he was sold to the Ishmaelites, so they were, they're traveling together. And so Joshua is then sold into slavery to them. And the rest of the story there goes that they had stripped him of this coat, and they put blood on it. They go back to their father, and they basically make up the story that he's been eaten by a wild animal. And of course, Jacob is distraught over all this. His favorite son is dead. Well, the Ishmaelites continue their travels, and he ends up in Egypt. And here we see Joseph making sort of a rise, but then a fall in Egypt, because the Ishmaelites sell him to one named Potiphar, Potiphar being a captain of the guards, a high-ranking official for Pharaoh, somebody that would have been wealthy. And so the Ishmaelites sell him to Potiphar. And so Joseph begins to work in Potiphar's house, and we find that Joseph does well. He's respected there. He's basically in charge of this entire household, making sure things are running as they should. But here he encounters Potiphar's wife, and Potiphar's wife begins to make advances toward him continually. And over again this happens, and Joseph turns her away. He knows it's not the right thing to do. And this continues to happen until one day she finds him there alone, and she presses even harder on this matter. And again, he doesn't want any part of it. He turns to run. She snatches his clothes, which he runs right out of, and he's gone. And she cries out that he's tried to take advantage of her. And ultimately, this gets back to her husband, Potiphar, who throws him in jail, has him placed in prison. And we find that when he's in prison there in chapter 39, verse 23, the keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. He's placed in prison, in specifically the king's prison, or Pharaoh's prison. It's a special prison, if you will. He's placed there, and he's there working and just being Joseph, doing the things that he does. And the prison official there takes notice. And with God's help, everything that Joseph did was made to prosper, and he was looked after in prison. And so this would continue then. And as we go into the next chapter, we see that Joseph is in prison. And again, this is the Pharaoh's prison, the king's prison. Well, Pharaoh becomes upset with his chief butler or cupbearer and his chief baker, and he throws them into prison. And so they're thrown into prison where Joseph is currently residing. And as they're in prison, they have dreams. The butler has a dream, the baker has a dream, and they're wondering to themselves, who can interpret these things? And Joseph basically says, only God can interpret these dreams. Tell them to me. What did you dream about? And so he interprets the dreams and basically lets them know that, well, in 3 days, the butler, the cupbearer, you're going to be restored back to your position where you once had been. But the baker, well, you're going to lose your life. Well, it turned out 3 days later, as Pharaoh is having a party. I think it was around like his birthday, if I remember right, and he has this party, and of course the cupbearer is restored and put back into his position, and the baker loses his life, just as the dreams had said. And so when this happens, prior to this, Joseph had talked to the butler and had said, when you get out of here, remember me. Basically saying, I'm innocent. I didn't do these things I was accused of. Can you let somebody know that for me? Could you maybe return the favor a little bit and help me out? And so what happens is, of course, as I mentioned, he was out, he was restored, the baker was hanged, and the chief butler did not remember him. As soon as he gets out, he forgets him. And so here's Joseph again in the state where he had risen to a certain level in Potiphar's house, has been put in prison. He's sort of elevated in prison, if you will, as best he can be. At the time when he thinks, okay, I'm going to get out of here, he's forgotten yet again. And so we see Joseph being left there, and he would remain there for 2 more years. 2 more years he would remain in the prison. Well, what happens next is Pharaoh then has his own dreams. Pharaoh's dreaming about things that are going to happen to Egypt, are going to happen to the people, to him. And suddenly the butler remembers this. He remembers Joseph being in prison. He says, hey, there was this Hebrew there, and I had a dream, and the baker had a dream, and he told us exactly what was going to happen, and it did happen that way. Well, Pharaoh had gone to everybody else looking for the answers, to his magicians and sorcerers or whatever they were, and trying to find it. Of course, they didn't know. And so when he's told this, he says, all right, bring him out here. And so Joseph then is brought out of prison. I often wonder what Joseph was thinking when he's brought in before Pharaoh, and there's the butler, the cupbearer, standing there who has forgotten him for 2 years. But we don't see anything about that. Nothing's said about it. But Pharaoh then tells Joseph the dreams, and Joseph then is able to help him understand that there's going to be a famine in the land. There's going to be many years of struggle that are coming before them. But if you do these things, you'll be prepared and you'll be able to take care of the people. And so Pharaoh's looking at this and listening to it, and he understands and believes what Joseph says, and he's trying to consider, well, who can take care of all this? Who can make sure this is all done? Who has the wisdom to do all that? And so this advice was good to him. And he's asking that question, can we find somebody to handle this task? Can we find somebody that will be able to handle that? And he says there, a man in whom is the Spirit of God. See, even Pharaoh was looking at this and understanding that there was something greater here, something bigger that had happened. Why did he have this dream? And why did it answer these questions? And why did it help him to be prepared? He needed somebody that could take care of that. Well, that somebody turned out to be Joseph. He understood that Joseph had that answer, and Joseph was the one that would be able to handle it. And so we see that Joseph goes into this position of being the one that would handle preparing for this famine that would come. And then during that famine would be the one that would oversee making sure that people had what they needed and handing that out appropriately. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all lands. This wasn't just an Egypt problem. It was something that had spread out to the neighboring countries in the region. others were going to have this problem. And so his preparations were critical in this matter. Well, as it turns out, this famine reaches out and now is impacting Joseph's father and his brothers and their families. And so we see Joseph then going through and he's doing the work that he's been asked to do. But Jacob sends his brothers to Egypt, and they go there to ask for grain, things to help sustain them. And so they end up before Joseph. But they don't recognize Joseph. But Joseph knows who they are. He recognizes them right away. And so we start to see over the next several chapters events playing out where Joseph is somewhat testing them and trying to make sure, they really are who they are. I mean, he knows who they are, but he's really just testing their resolve in these things and making sure they kind of start to learn some things. And so they're there asking for this grain. And so what happens is they ask for this, and he understands that there's another brother that's been left, Benjamin, who's back home. And so he says to them, "Do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to your prison house. But you go and carry grain for the famine of your houses, and bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words will be verified, and you shall not die." And they did so. When they first had arrived there, he basically had accused them of being spies and had put them in kind of confinement in a prison house, had confined them there. And then this conversation's going on, and he's saying, "All right, you need to go back and get your younger brother and bring him back to me. But you're going to have to leave one of the brothers here, and he'll be confined," kind of as a ransom there to make sure that you guys come back. And so Simeon, we find, is left there, and they end up going back to their father with this grain that they had been given. And so they go back to Egypt with the grain. Unbeknownst to them, Joseph has made sure that the money they brought has been put back into the sacks. So they get back to, or on their way back to their home, and at one point open the sacks to feed their animals and find this money that's in there. And now they're distraught because now what's happened? We paid this money, and now this money's right back in our sacks. And their statement was, "What has God done to us?" They end up going back to Jacob with all this. They spend their time talking to him and recounting the story. They still don't know that Joseph is Joseph, but they're basically saying, "All right, we've gone there, we've talked to him about what our needs were, we talked to him about our family, and we had a brother back home, and now Simeon is in prison, and we need to take him back." And of course, Jacob is just beside himself, because why would all this happen? He's upset with them because they said that they had another brother at home. Why would you tell them that, he says? Why would you let them know these things? They didn't think anything about it. And so Jacob's other favorite son, Benjamin, is now there, and they're wanting to take him back to Egypt. And he's in this position where he's lost one son. He thinks one of his sons are dead. He has another one that's in prison in Egypt. He's faced with, now I've got to send another son back with all of them to Egypt. And he's just very frustrated, and he's really kind of digs his heels in and says, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. He kind of seems like he was willing to leave Simeon there. Just, oh well, that's what was going to happen. And so this goes on for a bit, and ultimately the food runs out. They need more food, and the brothers say, "We can't go back without Benjamin. We can't do it." And Judah speaks to his father and basically says, I'll make sure that he's taken care of. I'll make sure that nothing happens, and if it does, it'll be on my head if that happens. And that's interesting because Judah was one of the brothers involved in the plot with Joseph before. He was perfectly willing to toss Joseph in a well, to sell him off to the Ishmaelites, to go and make up these lies to his father, which still have not yet been revealed. And so it's interesting that he's offering now to look after Benjamin as they go back. And so they go back and they end up in front of Joseph, and they basically say, look, we don't know what happened. We took the grain you gave us, and our money was there, and we brought it back with us. And Joseph says to them, peace be with you. Do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money. Then he brought Simeon out to them. I had to go reread this a couple of times because when I read this, I started questioning the story, what had happened. If you go back, Joseph made sure that money was in their sacks. He had them do that. It was there. And then he tells them here, God gave you that. God put that in your sack. I had your money. Now, maybe he kept the money they gave and he put different money, it could be something like that. But it would seem here that Joseph is trying to start to get them to understand a bigger picture message here. They're sitting here trying to worry and work things out and just kind of spiraling all the time. He's watching his brother. I mean, obviously he's been on the receiving end of this, but it seems he's trying to get them to understand that God has his hand in their life, and if they would start to trust that a little bit, maybe they'd make some better decisions, better choices. And so he brings Simeon out to them, and they begin to talk, and he basically is going to send them back again because he wants to have his father brought to them. And so he's going to send them out again and gets grain ready and gets them all these provisions packed up. But this time he has his silver cup placed in Benjamin's belongings. And they pack up to leave and they head off down the road. And Joseph waits a little bit. And Joseph sends somebody after them to basically accuse them of theft. And of course, the brothers are, we haven't stolen anything. I mean, we brought your money back that was in our bags before, and they're just beside themselves. We didn't do anything. And so they forced them to open up all their belongings and take everything out, and basically said, whoever we find, Joseph had sent word, whoever has my belongings, they're going to be my slave at this point. And they go through everything, and of course, they open Benjamin's belongings, and there's the cup. And I could just hear the wailing from these men. Now they've just, now they've done it. Their father's remaining favorite son is now going to be enslaved in Egypt. And what are they going to do about all this? And so we see Judah again making intercession. Because the statement had been made to them in chapter 17 about enslaving the one who had this. Judah goes back to Joseph and basically throws himself at Joseph, trying to intercede, trying to change things, and basically take Benjamin's place. Don't do this to our father. He already thinks our other brother is dead. We've had all these difficulties. He's really trying to spell that out for him, and so he's really trying to intercede yet again. At least he's keeping his word that he had to his father, that he was going to try to make sure he took care of Benjamin. He's working through that and doing those things. Well, finally, Joseph has worked through this as far as he can. Up to this point, he's already had situations where he's heard the things that his brothers are saying. They've already been talking about what they did to him. They didn't realize that he understood what they were saying because he would deal with them through an interpreter. So when they would talk, he could understand every word they were saying, but they didn't know that about him. And so he's already aware that they're already distraught about what they had done to him. And so we find him revealing himself. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? His brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. How could this be that this is Joseph? All these times we've been before him. How could this be? And so they're in this state and in this difficulty. And all the things that they have done must have been washing over them at this point. Here they had sold him off and basically had considered him dead and told their father he was dead. Well, Jacob ends up going to Egypt because they want to bring back his father and really all the family of Jacob, all the sons and their families and everything with them. And so God speaks to Israel or Jacob in a vision of the night and says, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. And so he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? He had promised this to Jacob's father, Jacob's grandfather. This idea of them becoming a great nation and a great people. And time had gone on and on. It hadn't happened yet. But here he is telling Jacob the same thing. Don't be afraid. Go down there. Go to Egypt. You're going to become a great nation. And so what ends up happening is Joseph ultimately becomes what's called governor of Egypt, or just an overseer in Egypt. He's second only to Pharaoh. Pharaoh basically says, you're running the country. All I'm going to do is sit on the throne. That's my position, but everything else you're going to take care of. And so Joseph is in that position as they're working through not only the preparations for the famine, but also the years where there was famine. He was overseeing all of that. And so the family ends up coming and settling in Goshen, and ultimately see that Jacob gets older and he blesses all of his children, including Joseph's two children, Ephraim and Manasseh, that were born to him during the time when he was preparing for this famine. And so they're all blessed. They're all in a place where they're cared for. They have what they need. They've now settled in this land, and they're starting to thrive and grow. And then ultimately in chapter 50, we see the death of Joseph. We see the end of Genesis, the last words of Joseph's life, that Joseph was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And you think about this whole account of Joseph's life, and you start to zoom out and look at the account of Scripture, and specifically Genesis and the beginnings of Genesis, where God is creating the world and how mankind has sinned and taken that to a terrible place, separated from God. And we see this family of Abraham that God has watched over and is making promises to and blessing. And we see everything that's happened to Joseph, and everything ends up with Joseph in a coffin in Egypt. It puts us in a place where we think, how terrible. All of this has come to that. Of course, we know from our study the last year what happens in Exodus. We know what happens to God's people as they've thrived and they've grown. It's been a thread of God's providence, God's hand in the lives of these individuals to ensure that his purposes are being met for mankind. So let's think about next the providence in Joseph's life. Let's look at some of those examples, things that happened that seem to be partly at the hand of God. But I also want you to consider and continue to remember that these individuals were making choices in their lives, things that they were choosing to do and say, and how they handled themselves. And so we think about at the right time, the well was empty. They ended up in a place where they were out there away from their father, and they were by a well that was empty. They cast him into that empty pit where there was no water. You know, these were vital to that region, to have these wells so that they could feed their flocks and they could drink while they were out in this hot area. And to come upon one that didn't have water, and that be the one that they toss him into, it just happened to be there at the right time. And as they're sitting there by that, at the right time, the traders pass by. They could have passed by a day earlier, a day later, that morning, that night. But they happen to pass by while Joseph is down there, while his brothers are sitting there eating their lunch and stewing about what they're going to do and how they're going to handle this because they're so angry with him and how they're going to lie to their father. And along come these traitors. And the brothers say to themselves, here's an opportunity. Rather than killing him, we'll make some money off of him. We'll sell him off. And they grabbed that opportunity. They made that decision. They could have snatched him up out of that pit and sent him back home to dad. A lot of choices could have been made here, but they chose to pull him up and sell him to the Ishmaelites. And something else to remember about this particular verse here, I have it highlighted, the Ishmaelites are the ones that they sold him to. And providentially, God has been working through the Ishmaelites for several generations before this. Because if you remember, Ishmael was the son of Hagar, who was Abraham and Sarah's servant. When Sarah couldn't have a child, she sends Abraham into her, and she has Ishmael. And there's a lot of family choices and decisions that happen there that they had to live with some of their decisions. But ultimately, God says Ishmael is going to have a family as well. I'm going to make a nation out of Ishmael. You see, God was over there preparing people in another place that are going along all this time. And at the right time, part of that family passes by that well that was sitting there, and they can buy Joseph and take him away from that. Well, he ends up being sold to Potiphar, as I mentioned earlier. He could have been sold to anyone. He could have remained a slave to the Ishmaelites. They could have taken him to Egypt and taken him back to their home. They could have done all manner of things along the way. They could have gotten tired of him and killed him themselves. But they don't. They take him to Egypt, and maybe they're being opportunistic as well, and they sell him to Potiphar because he's got the means to pay for him. And so he ends up in this house where he has the opportunity to be cared for, to grow, to flourish, and to do well. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, he had this situation where you had a bad person with bad motives, and she's making choices that aren't the best, while Joseph is making the choices to avoid her and try to stay away from that, and he ends up in prison. Doesn't seem right, does it? He did the right thing, but there he is in prison. And that's the way it is sometimes. We make the right choices, we do the right things, but sometimes bad things come about from that. But he's favored there in prison. He's given that opportunity yet again to be cared for. He could have been thrown in any other prison in Egypt. I have no doubt there were other places where prisoners were kept that weren't necessarily special for Pharaoh, for the king. He could have been put in any of those. He could have been left to die in any of those. But he was put in a place where he found favor because God helped him with that. At the right time, the butler and the baker were sent to that same prison. They could have been also sent anywhere else. They could have also just immediately lost their lives had Pharaoh chosen to do that. But instead, he sends them there. And they had those dreams that he was able to listen to and help interpret. Why did they have those dreams? Why did they think about those things? Same reason Joseph had the dreams he had. Same reason Pharaoh was going to have the dream he was going to have, or dreams. God's hand was at work with these individuals. At the right time, the butler remembers him. You know, it's frustrating, and I mentioned earlier, why, you know, I've got to wonder what Joseph was thinking when the butler finally remembered him after all this time. Probably was frustrating to him. You don't see Joseph saying a word about that. But it was done at a certain time, as God intended. Joseph remained there where he was, and at the right time, that butler says, oh yeah, I remember this guy. I remember he was able to help us with this. Maybe he can help you, Pharaoh. At the right time, he remembered those things. And so Joseph then can come out and he can interpret those dreams. And so because of that, because God is helping him with these things, he is able to rise to power at the right time. If that hadn't happened in Potiphar's house, he maybe just would have remained there forever until he got old and died. They wouldn't have needed him to do anything else. He would have just remained there. But because of these events and what has happened, it put him in a position to be able to help Pharaoh and to be able to then rise to power. And Pharaoh says, basically, only in regard to the throne am I going to be greater than you. That's a very high position to put someone in. A Hebrew on top of that. Somebody that wasn't even Egyptian, that's ended up here as a slave and a prisoner and now is in this position, and he's elevated him to that. That all happened at the right time, when God needed it to happen. Joseph has 2 sons at the right time. He had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and I think it's interesting, this passage, because it says, Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. I want you to remember this passage when we get to the last slide. I have to be careful when I say things. I've done that in the last sermon. I said I'm going to come back to something and then I forgot to do it, but I'm going to try really hard to remember this. Remember to come back to this. We'll talk about something in the end. Look at how he names them and what those things mean. The first one, God has made me forget all my toil. He's looking and saying, God has prospered me to the point that I can forget all the bad things that have happened in my life. I can forget about all that. And he looks at Ephraim, or calls the other one Ephraim, because God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Look at how he's looking at God here. He's saying, I've had all these events in my life, and maybe they're not the best. Maybe they're not how he would have certain things worked out at the time he's experiencing them. But look at how they've turned out now. God caused me to be fruitful. God took him from one place to another, a place where he was, and put him in something different and better because God needed his purposes to be served. Joseph's family goes to Egypt at the right time. When that famine had started and they needed something, they went to Egypt. Now, I don't know, could they have gone somewhere else? Perhaps. I don't know. We're not really told that. It sounds like the way it reads to us that famine was very widespread, spread out to a lot of the surrounding areas and nations. And so we find that Jacob has heard that there is grain in Egypt. How did he hear that? This is not something you watch on the nightly news back then. Perhaps it was these traders that are going back and forth, and people are going to Egypt, and they're coming back with provisions, things that they need, and as they're passing by, where did you get these things? We got them in Egypt. There's someone down there that can help you if you go to Egypt. And so he gets this message at the right time, and he sends his sons there at the right time to ensure that they have what they need to survive. And God's plan was revealed at the right time. This is where our reading was this morning. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, this is after Jacob has died, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. I'll pause there for a minute. Everything that's happened to them up to this point, where they have been cared for, and everything that Joseph has helped them to understand, when Jacob dies, their first thought is, now we're in trouble. Now Joseph's going to get us. He's going to hate us. He's going to treat us terrible. He's going to repay us for everything we've done. How terrible that they have gone through all of this and everything that Joseph has done only to settle on that conclusion, that he's going to do harm to them. Continues, so they sent messengers to Joseph saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Jacob clearly knows everything had been revealed, what they had done by this point. And so he says, "Now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God your father." And Joseph wept when he spoke to them. And then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, "Behold, we are your servants." And Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant it evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is to stay, to save many people alive." What perspective Joseph had at this point in his life. Am I in the place of God? Am I in control of things? He was at the top of Egypt, with only Pharaoh above him, but essentially the top person. He had everything. He was in control of everything. And he says these words, "Am I in the place of God?" He knew God was above him, and he knew God was in control of the things in his life and had brought him through all these different aspects of his life. So when he looks at his brothers, he says, "You guys meant this as evil. You guys didn't. I'm not denying what you did was bad. But God meant it all for good. God made good out of all of this. Out of your horrible decisions, your plots against me, your lies, the back and forth that we had over the years, God meant that all for good." And look at it, he says, to save many people alive. He's kind of, as the saying goes, jerking a knot in them a little bit. He's kind of going in there, kind of tugging on them and saying, "You need to wake up and see what's going on here. You've been seen through all this, and it's the hand of God that you're here and that you're cared for." And so at the right time, we see Jacob's family being saved. Egypt and other nations are basically saved because of what has happened and what Joseph has led them through. The Israelites prosper, all because of providence and without violating anybody's free will. They all made their choices and what they said and did, both good and bad, and God used all of that to make sure that his will was done. Providence. At the right time, all these things happened. Well, what are we going to take home? I made Mike a pizza box because he likes the pizza box pictures, and he's not here. Hopefully he'll watch online. But what are we going to take home? What are you going to put in your box and take home this week and think about? And how are you going to use that in your life? How are you going to use Joseph's life and the thoughts on providence from day to day? I was thinking about how to wrap this up. And I guess it is whenever you're thinking about lessons on providence that you become aware sometimes of things that pop into your head or thoughts you have or things that may occur, and you think, I wonder why that thought came to me when it did. And lessons like this kind of start to help you understand that. And I was sitting here thinking one day, how do I really kind of summarize and bring this down? And one of our friends of our family, and a friend of many here, Heather Bryan, if you know Heather, her family is over at West Metro, and Heather wrote something on Facebook one day, and I'm going to paraphrase it up here in just a moment. She wrote that down, and it occurred to me, this is a summation of what happened to Joseph's life. And I'm coming back to the thing I said I was going to come back to, because I didn't forget. She says, "Don't underestimate the power of digging up a plant and moving it a few feet. I've had a rose bush that hasn't done anything for 4 years, and I moved it this spring. It's literally scooted over 3 feet. I don't know if it needed to be disturbed, but I've gone from 1 rose to no less than 13. Here was a plant in the ground. It's growing. Save for the fact that there was no flower or only 1 flower growing on it, it was not producing fruit. It was there in the ground. And someone might come along and say, it's rooted, it's growing, it's thriving. It seems like it's where it needs to be. But the simple act of picking it up disturbing it and moving it over a few feet and replanting it, and suddenly it's flourishing. It's producing these flowers. Think about Joseph's life and what we went through today. Joseph was at home with his father, dad's favorite, had the special clothes, things are going well. Not a care in the world. Someone could look at him and say, looks pretty good to me. Things look like they need to, but not with God. Things happened in Joseph's life that uprooted him, that disturbed his life. He still had choices that he had to make and things that he had to do. He had to go through difficulties and challenges, but he was uprooted and he was replanted somewhere else. And ultimately, that entire family was uprooted and replanted in Egypt. And what's the end result of that? They would grow and they would flourish in Egypt. And ultimately, they would become this great nation that God would then one day remove from Egypt and deliver to a land that he had promised them. They were uprooted and they were replanted. And all of that made them flourish and produce fruit that they needed to produce. So I want you to think about yourself for a moment. Are you being moved so that you may start to grow? Are there things in your life that are uprooting you? And when you see those things happening, are you looking at them and going, I don't want that to happen. That's not what I want. I'm comfortable where I'm at. I'm in the place where I think everything's going good, and these things are disturbing me, and they're causing me challenge. Have that mindset like Joseph. Whatever's going on in your life, God meant it for good. God meant these things for good. Think about that. I've really started to put that thought in my brain lately. Whatever's going on in my life, God meant it for good. And sometimes that means it's things that aren't pleasant. They're not what I want. They're challenging. There's somebody that comes along that maybe I don't, get along with like I should, or maybe things at work aren't as they should be, or whatever the case may be. There may be things that come along. And there may also be things that happen in my life that are so good that I'm sitting back going, I don't need to change anything. I'm rooted where I need to be. This all seems to be going well. And that can be equally as dangerous. So what choices are you making in your life, good and bad, that may be keeping you rooted in one place? Because there can be good choices that you're making on the surface that you say, well, this seems to be the right thing, but perhaps it's causing you not to grow and flourish as you should, or certainly bad choices will do that as well. They may put us in the wrong place. The interesting thing, though, is that when we look at the life of Joseph and we see the decisions that people are making, good and bad, that God is able to take every single one of those and make the dots connect and end up from point A to point B just as he said they would be. He knows how to make that work, even with the decisions and choices that we make. I want you to consider one final thought. Talk about being uprooted, put in a different place. You can think about Jesus in this manner. If you look at Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, it says this, "Let this mind be in you which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Therefore God also has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name. And at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, and those in heaven and those on earth and those under the earth, that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." Jesus, with God in heaven, that perfect place, gave that up, was uprooted, so to speak, became a servant. Didn't come here to be served, but to serve. And he spent his time here, and he ultimately, to the point of death on the cross, and after that was exalted to that high position where only the throne of God is above. And we see that every knee should bow, those in heaven and those on earth and those under the earth, that every tongue should confess Jesus Christ as Lord. Friends, if Jesus can give these things up and do so for you and I, how much more can you and I look at life and the things that we endure and understand that God means them all for good? I would encourage you today to think about these thoughts and consider how God is at work in your life, how his hand may play a role in the things that you have going each and every day. Think about the decisions and choices that you make and how God may be using those to uproot you and plant you in the place you need to flourish. Our Savior left heaven and made that sacrifice for us, and for you and I, we can be drawn to him. If for someone here today that is not a child of God, who has never made that decision to enter the waters of baptism, I want to challenge you to think about that, to let your life be uprooted, enter the waters of baptism, and let that replant you in a place where you can begin to grow and flourish. And I warn you that it could be easy to remain where you're at, to stay stuck in your seat and say, I think everything's going okay. And maybe you're a child of God and you've been serving God for many years, and maybe you're in a position as well where you're thinking about your life and your service to God, and perhaps you're considering, are you growing as you should be? And maybe you need help with that, and maybe we can pray with you and we can encourage you and help you to try to meet those needs. We're going to sing a song that was selected for us here in just a moment, and Silas will lead us in that. If you have a need for any reason, please come have a seat on the front as we stand together and sing.